Earth is a small blue marble floating in the quiet inky sea, dimly lit by that flickering candle. A thin film covers the surface, oblivious to the miasmic waves beyond its horizons. Never before has this film come so close to total extermination since times of prehistory. The 1950s was a time of prosperity, improved living standards across the globe, new technologies, and new forms of self-expression. The decade saw humanity, like a phoenix from its ashes, re-emerge from the devastation of World War II. Born alongside the phoenix were new tensions as an ideological struggle gripped the world. The young countries wielded such awesome powers that overshadowed all other advancements, weapons that could reach anywhere on the globe and destroy entire cities, all in a matter of hours. In an interconnected world where no one could escape the terror, many looked to the skies. The United States and Soviet Union both took an interest in rocketry in their attempts to secure military dominance over one another, keeping their discoveries from the world and only sharing through espionage. In their race for the high ground, scientists began to look beyond conventional rocketry, beyond the bounds of our atmosphere and into space. The US government poured hundreds of millions into their Air Force for the development. As the Cold War progressed, more and more focus was put on the ideological battle over the military struggle, encapsulated in the race for scientific breakthroughs to prove moral superiority, such as the Air Force rocket program transitioning to the civilian NASA space program. In the early years of the NASA organization, there were many failures with very few successes. By the winter of 1957, the Soviets succeeded in putting the first satellites into Earth orbit, beating the US by launching the first satellite, Sputnik 1, and then launching the first life into space, Laika. But Americans were determined to not lose a third time. They were desperate to beat their rivals by putting the first men into space, and so NASA set out with the Mercury program. Initiated on October 7, 1958, the program's focus was on obtaining manned orbit around the Earth and to determine the ability of a pilot to function in space. Much of the program was a continuation of previous Air Force missions, such as the Man in Space Soonest project, unfortunately abbreviated to MISS. These previous attempts gave the newly formed NASA, which was just 6 days old, not only valuable information on rocketry and spaceflight, but also proven reliable parts, such as the carrier rockets meant to carry the crew to space. But before rockets would ever reach the skies, there had to be extensive development on the ground. Ground-to-space communication systems, rocket construction by names such as Chrysler and Convair, and testing and training happened across the contiguous United States. The initial thought process for rocket construction was to use previously known technologies and off-the-shelf equipment whenever possible. However, many new systems were necessary for the project. The ships needed to have the ability to actually safely carry a man to orbit without bringing back a corpse. And to avoid a national embarrassment, everything from abort systems to unaerodynamic designs were taken into consideration. Many unmanned rocket missions were undertaken, the first of which was Little Joe 1, launched on August 21, 1959, and used to develop the abort system. Continuing with the American tradition of ineptitude in the space race, half an hour before the scheduled launch, an explosion would go off on the launch pad, as the capsule and tower combination attempted to prematurely launch, out of sequence with the rest of the rocket. Later revealed in the September accident report, the failure was the result of an electrical leak. The final design for the spacecraft had only 100 cubed feet of habitable space, enough for one crew member to pilot. Engineered to withstand the heat and vibrations of both launch and re-entry, the pod was cone-shaped with a dull gray coloring, a result of the nickel alloy used to coat the bottom half. This classic silhouette aided in slowing the craft down on re-entry, alongside several parachutes. However, being a first-generation spacecraft, it was far from perfect. Uncomfortable, full of analog controls, and extremely heavy for its size at 3,000 pounds, the craft was far from the sleek and elegant space travel we have come to expect in our modern times. Planned to splash down in the ocean to be recovered after missions, flotation devices were installed which would ensure the spacecraft would remain buoyant and stable in the waters, never to be lost to the sea no matter what. On May 5, 1961 at 9:34 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Freedom 7, the first U.S. manned mission to space, was launched. With minimal troubles while preparing and a perfect takeoff, man was in space for approximately 5 minutes, staying off the ground for a little over 15 minutes. Although orbit was not reached, the mission's success proved NASA's ability to match Soviet space technology, and the American public cheered as their hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars claimed their nation 5 minutes of glory. More importantly, the craft was retrieved as its flotation devices worked perfectly, proving they would never fail the pod. The very next mission, the capsule would sink into the ocean, leaving Virgil Gus Grimson stranded in the Atlantic for the longest 4 minutes of his life. Luckily, though, the mission of Liberty Bell 7 was only another suborbital mission, which succeeded in all other goals besides spacecraft recovery. Even better, the flotation devices never failed, the ship only sinking 15,000 feet into the unrecoverable deep because of the premature firing of an explosively actuated egress hatch, allowing him to quickly egress from the rapidly submerging cone. Another win for the Americans. Cape Canaveral had just been cleared. On February 20th, 1961, with an audience of 75,000 in the nearest town of Cocoa Beach, the mission Mercury Atlas 6 rocket is ready to put John Glenn Jr. into orbit. Spacecraft Friendship 7 is about to aggressively hand it to the Soviets, an uproar so cool they had to literally go to space just to do it. Navy boats and helicopters were on standby for collection, and the antsy public watched from TV screens across the country. Liftoff occurs at 9:47 a.m., and the astronaut accelerates to a max velocity of 17,544 miles per hour and experiences g-forces of 7.7 Earth magnitudes. While powered flight would only last 5 minutes, Glenn Jr. would experience weightlessness far longer than his predecessors, with an orbit maintained around Earth for 3 cycles with a flight duration of almost 5 hours. Aside from the minor and tedious troubles while prepping for launch, the mission was not perfect. 2 major problems presented themselves in flight. The first and most apparent being the loss of automatic yaw control at the end of the first orbit. The official NASA website can be quoted as saying, "A yaw altitude control jet apparently clogged at the end of the first orbit, forcing the astronaut to abandon the automatic control system for the manual electric fly-by-wire system." End quote. Dodgy reporting aside, the second major issue occurred upon preparing for re-entry into the atmosphere. It was reported to ground control by the on-ship computer that the heat shield had been prematurely released. The heat shield that was supposed to protect both the spacecraft and Glenn Jr. from disintegrating in the upper atmosphere. Ground crews scrambled to come up with a plan to save the pilot, and it was decided to retain the retro pack as opposed to jettisoning it as planned. This sandwiched the heat shield in between the pack and the ship body, preventing it from coming loose, and as the astronaut dropped below the Kármán line and safely touched down some 800 miles off the coast of Bermuda, the public cheered as the overworked NASA engineers and scientists let out a sigh of relief knowing they would keep their jobs. Ironically enough, turns out the heat shield was never in danger of slipping off. The computers which reported its unexpected release just had a faulty switch in the heat shield circuit, a discovery which came a bit too late to provide any relief. So, the American public, government, and scientists all marveled at their grand achievement, putting a man in space, in orbit around our little blue marble, a task dreamed of since ancient times and that has inspired wonderment throughout the ages. Unfortunately, the Soviets did it well over 10 months ago, and everyone was painfully aware of this. The cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin previously completed a full orbit around the planet in the Vostok 1 spacecraft, and the US was still playing catch-up. Despite all this, NASA was not done with the Mercury program and still had more manned missions planned. There was a total of 3 additional crewed missions, Mercury Atlas 7, 8, and 9, all 3 of which being of minimal interest. MA7's goal was to basically just confirm the results of the previous mission, with the only differences being a slightly improved Atlas rocket model and some surprisingly good pre-launch luck, only stalling to wait for improved weather, not because it posed a threat to the craft, but because NASA wanted better camera coverage. The first real anomaly was detected post-liftoff, when an abort system hydraulic primed. This was the result of faulty mechanics incorrectly sensing a gradual pressure drop in the ship. However, a separate pressure transducer showed air pressure as proper, preventing the actuation of the hydraulic and sudden disassembly of the craft. While in orbit, however, it was discovered that a pitch scanner, part of the automatic control system, had failed, and while this was the most detrimental challenge to the mission, manual pilot correction compensated for the device's failure. MA8 may be the most forgettable manned mission of the entire program. NASA's official website barely discusses the mission on its dedicated page, only giving a short list of its stats in a single sentence. The mission was successful. Total time weightless was 8 hours, 56 minutes, 22 seconds. End quote. Enos the Astrochimp, pilot of the Mercury Atlas V mission, had a longer entry. The most that can be said is that Walter Schirra, pilot of the Sigma 7, was in space about twice as long as the orbital, human, and space monkey pilots before him. Also, Enos survived splashdown and was technically the first American hominid to reach Earth orbit. The final Mercury mission, Mercury Atlas 9, simply was more of the same stuff seen in previous missions. The only reason it can be called notable is its duration. This was a 24-hour space mission, more accurately lasting a total of 34 hours, 3 minutes, and 30 seconds. Yet it still isn't exactly impressive on account of the Soviets having already done a day-long orbital flight 6 months before the US even put a man into orbit for the first time. It is this final mission in the Mercury project that truly displays how far behind the country was in the space race. While it may have been amazing to the American public that they lived in an age where they could call themselves a spacefaring civilization, they were also forced to anxiously acknowledge the rapid progression of their rivals across the world, progression that their government seemingly couldn't compete with. A noticeable pattern across the Mercury program is that every manned mission had a spacecraft title preceded by 7. Freedom 7, Aurora 7, Faith 7, etc. This quirk in naming convention was very deliberate, symbolizing the close friendship of all the first astronauts. Despite the bitter truth they all knew of the lacking space program, there was still a sense of accomplishment that every participant in the mission took pride in, a pride that pushed them forward, a human pride that has been felt throughout history. From the Soviets watching Sputnik 1 launch to mankind's forgotten ancestors admiring their flint-tipped tools of intricate design, pride has pushed people forward throughout the march of time. So while it may seem like the Americans had little to be prideful over, it was their pride that pushed them after every defeat. Without Mercury's successful failures, the Kennedy administration wouldn't have been so dead set on landing humans on the moon. The Mercury program and all of its astronauts, from Ham the Chimp to L. Gordon Cooper Jr., played a vital role in the US eventually achieving their ultimate victory, landing a man on the moon and securing that massive scientific achievement and symbol of national pride. Without the Mercury missions and their defeat, the country would not have the know-how or drive to land on the moon. Without these first 6 crewed missions to space, 8 counting the monkeys, the United States would have only kept failing.